Gentle morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, illuminating the small room that 75-year-old Paul Douglas had called home for the past 2 years. He sat quietly on a wooden chair by the window, his eyes following the bustling crowd below on the busy streets of the big city. Yet, in his heart, the world seemed to have stopped moving a long time ago. The honking cars, the hurried footsteps, and even the chatter of passers-by couldn't erase the emptiness he felt every day. Paul had once been a simple farmer, spending his entire life working on vast fields in a peaceful rural village. The small house he had shared with his beloved wife, Elizabeth, wasn't large, but it was filled with laughter and love. Together, they built a simple but fulfilling life. The evenings spent tending to their small garden, the humble but warm family meals, they were all now faded memories, etched faintly in his mind. 2 years ago, Elizabeth passed away after a long illness. Losing his life partner, Paul didn't just lose his joy for life, he also lost his emotional anchor. The once cozy home now stood empty, uncared for. Ethan, his only son, decided to bring Paul to the city to live with his small family. Although Paul knew his son's intentions were good, he couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. The modern city, with its towering buildings and crowded streets, felt nothing like the serene countryside where he had spent his entire life. Ethan and his wife Laura had arranged a fully furnished room for him. Yet the room's neatness and order only made Paul feel like an uninvited guest. Each day, he sat by the window, staring outside, quietly reminiscing about the past. Here, Paul no longer felt the warmth of family, something he had once cherished above all else. One morning, while Paul was still lost in his memories, Ethan entered the room. His expression was serious, his voice steady. "Dad, tomorrow we're going on a long trip. Please prepare your belongings." Paul looked at Ethan and didn't ask further. He silently understood what was coming. The occasional pitying glances from Laura, the vague whispers from the neighbors, all of it seemed like a premonition. Perhaps this is the time they want to take me away, he thought. That night, he tossed and turned, unable to sleep. His feelings were indescribable, a mixture of sadness and relief. Looking at an old photograph of Elizabeth, he whispered, "Elizabeth, you'd understand, wouldn't you? I don't want to be a burden to our son anymore." He clutched the photo tightly in his hands, telling himself that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new journey, even if he didn't know what lay ahead. The next morning, Ethan entered the room carrying a small suitcase. Laura followed behind him, holding a towel and a few personal items. Their faces didn't reveal much emotion, but there was a certain warmth in Ethan's eyes. "Are you ready, Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice calm yet slightly hesitant. Paul nodded gently, pulling his thin coat over his shoulders before slowly standing up. His body was no longer as agile as it used to be, but he made an effort to move steadily, determined not to make the situation more difficult for anyone. He walked out into the yard, where the car was already waiting. Ethan opened the door and carefully helped him into the back seat. Paul sat down, clutching the small suitcase tightly in his hands. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. This might be the last time I leave this place. But he said nothing, quietly gazing out the window instead. The car started, leaving behind the noisy city streets as it gradually entered quieter, less crowded roads. Through the window, Paul watched as the scenery outside began to change. Skyscrapers and busy traffic receded into the distance, replaced by small houses, colorful gardens, and sprawling fields. The wind blew gently, carrying with it a faint, pleasant scent of grass and flowers. The passing scenery seemed to open up the pages of Paul's memories. He recalled his younger days, full of vitality, when he and Elizabeth worked together in their garden. He remembered her laughter as she trimmed the first roses of the season, the family meals where everyone gathered around the table, and the loving look in Elizabeth's eyes as she watched their young son, Ethan. Now, these memories were like faint echoes, lingering just enough to make Paul's heart feel heavier. He glanced at Ethan, wanting to say something, but stopped himself. Words seemed to get caught in his throat. Perhaps he didn't want to make this journey even harder. After a few hours, the car turned onto a small road lined with lush green trees on both sides. Paul felt a sense of unfamiliarity. This didn't match the image he had conjured in his mind of a nursing home. The rustling trees and the serene surroundings evoked a sense of comfort, yet Paul couldn't place where he'd seen anything like it before. The car continued deeper, winding through bends in the road until it stopped in front of a small house. Paul slowly stepped out, his legs stiff, as he stared at the scene in front of him. His heart pounded, and his eyes widened in disbelief at what he was seeing. It was his house. The house where he and Elizabeth had lived happily for so many years before the devastating fire that took everything from him. But miraculously, it was no longer the charred ruins from his memory. The house now stood in pristine condition, lovingly restored. Fresh white paint glistened in the sunlight, sparkling windows reflected the sky, and the clean wooden porch seemed like it had come straight out of his fondest memories. "Dad, welcome home," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. Paul stumbled, nearly losing his balance, but Ethan quickly caught him. "But how?" Paul stammered, his eyes welling with tears as he looked at his son, unable to comprehend. Ethan smiled, his gaze filled with joy. "After the fire, we decided to rebuild this house. We wanted you to feel like you were living in your happiest days again." Paul stepped slowly into the house, each footstep feeling as though it carried him back in time. Every corner of the house evoked a familiar memory. Photographs of Elizabeth and their family were carefully hung on the walls, warming the space with love. In the corner of the living room stood an old rocking chair, the same one where Paul used to sit and read to Elizabeth every evening. It looked freshly polished, as if it had never been touched by the flames. Paul sat down in the chair, his trembling hands tracing its smooth surface. "How did you do this?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Ethan smiled. "It took us quite some time, but this is something we always wanted to do. This house isn't just where you live, Dad. It's where our family's best memories are kept." That afternoon, Ethan took Paul to the backyard. Before his eyes was a small garden, meticulously cared for. Rows of vibrant flowers and lush green vegetables brought a sense of life and vitality to the space. Paul stood still, overcome with emotion as memories came flooding back. "Do you remember this garden, Dad? I planted it myself, just the way it used to be," Ethan said. Laura stepped out of the house, carrying a small basket filled with seeds. "We found these seeds while sorting through your old belongings," she said with a warm smile. "We thought you might like to plant them yourself." Paul took the basket in his trembling hands. A warm wave of nostalgia washed over him, as if time was rewinding, allowing him to step back into the best days of his life. That night, Paul sat in his old rocking chair, gazing out at the small garden glowing softly under the moonlight. The silver light bathed the flowers and plants, creating a serene and magical scene. The quiet was broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant chirping of crickets. The tranquility of the night was mirrored in Paul's heart, now filled with a newfound sense of warmth and peace. Slowly rocking back and forth, Paul's eyes lingered on the garden, each plant and flower evoking memories of the past, days he had spent with Elizabeth in the very same garden. For a long moment, Paul was lost in thought. As he reflected on his life, he realized something profound. All this time, he had let his fears and loneliness overshadow the love and care his son and daughter-in-law had been quietly giving him. He had imprisoned himself in feelings of inadequacy, believing he was a burden. But now, it was clear, he was not a burden. He was, and always had been, an indispensable part of their family. As Paul remained immersed in his thoughts, Ethan entered the room holding a photo album in his hands. "Dad?" Ethan said softly, breaking the silence. "I found these photos in the ashes after the fire, and I worked hard to save them. I thought you might want to see them." Ethan sat down beside him and handed over the album. Paul's trembling hands slowly opened the cover. On the first page, a photograph of Elizabeth appeared, her radiant smile immediately pulling at his heartstrings. As he turned the pages, more images came to life. Pictures of himself and Elizabeth, their life together, and Ethan as a young boy. Each photo seemed to pour a stream of warm memories into Paul's mind. He saw Elizabeth standing proudly in the garden with freshly picked flowers, the family gathered around the dinner table during the holidays, and candid moments he thought he had forgotten. The memories came rushing back, filling him with a mixture of joy and longing. Tears began to well up in Paul's eyes, streaming silently down his face. He turned to Ethan, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Ethan," he said softly. "Thank you for everything you've done for me." Ethan grasped his father's frail hand, his own eyes glistening. "No, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice filled with love. "Thank you for always being the best father I could ever ask for. You sacrificed so much for me, and this is just a small way for me to show how much I appreciate you." Paul fell silent, his gaze shifting back to the house. In that moment, he understood that the home had been rebuilt not just with bricks and wood, but with love, gratitude, and the sacrifices of his son and daughter-in-law. Every plank of wood, every carefully restored detail, carried the undeniable imprint of their deep care for him. This realization overwhelmed Paul with gratitude and an overwhelming sense of belonging. It was a lesson he hadn't fully grasped until now. Family isn't just about a roof over your head. It's about the unconditional love that ties people together, no matter what. Paul turned back to Ethan and smiled gently. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I thought I was a burden, but now I see that I've always been a part of this family. Thank you for reminding me of that, and I promise to honor your love by living my best life in this house." Later that evening, the family gathered around the dining table. The room was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation. Paul, Ethan, and Laura shared stories from the past, moments of humor, and even their hopes for the future. The warmth of their bond lit up the space, creating a picture of unity and love. Paul looked at his son and daughter-in-law, feeling a newfound appreciation for the life he still had. For the first time in many years, his heart felt light, free from the weight of doubt and loneliness. Paul's story is more than just the tale of a house being rebuilt. It's a journey of rediscovering lost memories and the true meaning of family love. It's a story about the revival of hope, where loss is replaced by care and compassion, and broken pieces are mended with love. If you enjoy heartwarming stories like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button for Life Stories 365 today. Each story we share is a meaningful journey, bringing you valuable life lessons and moments that warm the heart. Don't forget to share this story with your friends and family. Together, let's spread messages of kindness, love, and understanding. Thank you for being a part of our journey.